Hello, and welcome to the show. I'm Doris Mangrum, your host, and this is Stop the Madness, Practical Ways to Influence the Incarceration Crisis. For those of you who have been watching us on a regular basis, you know that we've been doing a Check the Reality series in this around incarceration, and today's part of the series is going to cover women and how the reality of incarceration has impacted them. Those of you who are regular watchers also know that my co-conspirator or co-partner in this series has been Lora Sall. Lora, I'm so happy to have you with me here again today.
I'm happy to be back.
And for those of you who may not, this may be your first time being a part of the show, Lora has worked on the inside, worked on the outside, all around the incarceration crisis in the community and with the families, etc. So she has a wealth of knowledge and background to talk about this. So today we're going to look at women, because when we hear of incarceration, probably the first thing that most people think is the man. And then beyond that, they think the men of color. And that is right. But there's also a very, very, very little known, except unless you're involved directly, that women are a great number behind the walls. There are 1 million women who are impacted by some form of criminal justice, 200,000 behind our prison and jail walls, but another 800,000 who are impacted by some other type of supervision, probation, parole, transition homes, and the like. Mm-hmm. And so what we're going to do today is to look at some of the myths around it, some of the realities, and check it all.
Okay.
So I think a good place for us to start is to look at that place around, you would think with this many women, there would be, of course, many prisons, right? Many places for people to come and visit them because there's so many of them, as I just said. Mm-hmm. Now, what do you think about that?
Well, there are.
There are?
Many prisons.
Yes.
Yes, and many women who are incarcerated, and unfortunately, there are a number of women who are incarcerated and pregnant.
Yes.
And having their children
yes.
behind the walls.
Yes.
And so it's not just impacting the women, it's impacting their children, their families, and the community as a whole, mm-hmm. just like it's impacting the men. But there's something unique and different about an incarcerated woman, both spiritually and emotionally incarcerated as well as physically incarcerated, and how she moves forward once she's no longer behind the walls of a jail or a prison, but how she moves forward in the community. And she takes that experience and lack of knowledge of self with her.
Wow, you've said a mouthful, Miss Lora. Let's go back.
Okay.
You've hit so many things that I want to touch on today. You talked about there being many prisons. Well, there are, but there's so many less prisons for women than there are mm-hmm. for men. So oftentimes, you talked about that family piece, mm-hmm. that family is going to have to go a lot farther distance than they would for a man, maybe, even though there may be a long distance for the men as well. But you also hit on something else. You talked about pregnancy, and you talked about family in much of your response. Let's talk about pregnancy and what that can look like, the reality that needs to be checked, if you will, around pregnancy behind the walls. Mm-hmm. To this day, California, I'm fortunate and happy to say, is not one of them, but to this day, many prisons, many states still shackle women during their pregnancy. When I say during their pregnancy, when they're transported back and forth to get their medical services, and even during the delivery. Speak to your feelings and your reality around, or what you know around that, or if you've ever seen it, but just what you know that can do to the psyche, not only of the woman, but perhaps even the stress from the woman having an impact on that unborn child.
Well, first of all, we know the impact of stress on any woman mm-hmm. during pregnancy and then during the delivery, and how it affects the birth of the baby and how that birth comes forth. whether or not it's an easy delivery, whether or not it's easier as a result of her being able to relax and give birth. And if you're shackled and you're unable to move about in order to being locked up and having to wear a certain color outfit on a regular basis, and having someone tell you when to get up and go to bed and when you can eat, whether or not you can go to the bathroom, having to get permission to do that. That's separate. And that said, I have had people with bachelor's degrees in biology, bachelor's degrees in accounting, CPAs, people who are business folks. These are all women who are in my classes, okay, job skills classes. These are not ignorant folks. These are not people who are just on the street, okay? I had one woman in one of my classes who was incarcerated, rightfully so, because of embezzlement. But the only reason she was able to embezzle $100,000 is because she had knowledge of accounting and in that position. And she was embezzling to help her other friends and family members who saw her ability to assist them, okay? And it cost her not only her freedom, but also her profession, because she can't work in that field anymore. But at the same time, she turned right around and picked up another career, another whole career. That's skills, okay? I have mechanics, women who are truck drivers, women who have abilities teaching, doing massage therapy and as well as teaching. These are their history. Women who have 25 years managing farms and cutting meat, okay? All kind of professions and abilities.
You know, it's so good that you are saying these things as it pertains to incarcerated women. We know the same kinds of things that pertain to the men as well. But I think it's great for people to hear the different categories, if you will, and the different experiences and different levels of expertise, because there is a skewed picture that is painted around who's behind those walls. And so we have to be careful when we make these broad statements to understand that there is not necessarily what you think it is, and it's not necessarily what's being portrayed to you. So as I'm listening to you, what I'm hearing is, you know, it's every race, every creed, every expertise from every background, and then even within those particular categories are categories that fall within those categories. So that is a myth that has been quickly debunked, if you will, because the reality is the women who are behind those walls come from every walk of life.
Just like our society.
Just like society, just like society. Now, there is some disproportionality, we know.
Yes.
We know it's a disproportionality in how many are behind those walls. So let's look at that myth, since I just said that word, disproportionality. You know, when we talk about it, one of the first things we say is there's, you know, more black and brown people behind the walls. And then some would say, well, as it pertains to the women, there's actually more white women behind the walls. Well, you know, that's real. There are, but now what the case comes in and the problem comes in, if you will, is the numbers of women based upon, you know, the reality of how many there are. So what I'm saying is 93 out of 100,000 white women, 347 out of 100,000 black women. So there's the difference right there when we talk about the disproportionality. And so across the board, we are black men, Latino men, black women, Latina are bigger numbers than the other races that are there, if you will. Now, the other thing I want to ask you about, though, Miss Sall, is around plea deal. And you know, we know about how sometimes the men are able to, we hear about it, we take the plea, you'll get out more quickly. Now, one of the myths is that women can take the plea deal as well. Now, do you know anything about that? Have you experienced hearing anything about women in the plea deal, and how and whether or not the same thing applies to them in terms of their ability to, you know, use that card, if you will, the plea card, to get them out of prison a little bit earlier?
The plea deals will vary.
Okay.
Okay. Part of those deals might be programs. Here you have rather than pleading for less jail time, you might plead to be placed in a certain program to what is it called, inpatient, or where you're dealing with your drug addictions, and if you plead to go to a program that's going to be a residential program where you get to spend a certain amount of time going through this program, then you can have less time on your sentence.
So this applies across the board for the men and women as well?
Men and women,
Okay.
but women tend to, from the women I've seen, they tend to choose a program versus more jail time.
Okay.
Okay, they're more apt to take a program versus going to jail, whereas a man might say, I can do this
I'll
time.
do my time.
Yeah, I'm just go
Or
and
take
run
the
into.
deal. Take the deal, or if I don't take the deal, just I'll do my time and not gonna worry about doing any programming.
Exactly, exactly. In some cases.
Yeah. Oh, well,
in some
yeah. Oh,
cases.
yeah.
But then men might have a variety of sentences. And so if you're looking at someone that has a history of drug addiction, he might decide, okay, I'm finally going to give into the program, residential program. Whereas there are some that might accept a program while being in jail, go to classes, finish out this program in the jail, and then I can have time
And I'm
cut
free
off.
when I go. Yeah, I'm
Right.
done.
Whereas the women are going to be more willing to go into a residential program. Now, there are exceptions to every rule.
Oh, of course. None of this
Yeah.
is across the board. I know.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that comes to mind when I think about plea and some of the experiences I remember, you know, I'd ask the women, you know, well, you know, I wouldn't necessarily ask because I try not to ask when I was on the inside. But they would tell you, I couldn't take a plea deal because I didn't have anybody to turn in. I didn't have anything to give up for getting on the outside, because typically most of the women were there behind being connected to some male and their drug runs. And because of the mandatory sentencing and them not having anything really to give up to help them get out, they would end up doing sometimes longer time than the men who were, you know, you would think the main people who should have been doing more time, but they had nothing to give. So we then would find them behind the walls longer. And we see that now. I mean, it's not that it's gone away. It's not like we're talking about it in past tense. But it was, and it still is. And some of the things that you just talked about the classes are beginning to use, we're beginning to look at some alternative methods to incarceration.
But also, it's not so much that they didn't have anything to give. Oftentimes, they're not willing
Ooh,
to
you hit
give.
it. That's so right.
Okay?
Yep.
They're going to protect that man
At all
over their own freedom.
Yes.
And even though they can have less time or no time, they're willing to say nothing, do the time, let him get out or get time off. And they'll go ahead and serve the time because they feel like he's going to be there waiting for them. It's not always the case.
Most of the time, it's not the
No,
case.
you know.
You know, there's as you just said, the words you just said conjured in my mind the impact that mother being gone is having on whomever she left behind. And in many cases, stats say that there's about 77% of women who are incarcerated that are mothers were actively parenting their children at the time, regardless of what other things they may have been doing. Their children were with them. So there is a myth that says that women who are incarcerated have better caretaker support for their children on the inside. What has been the information or experience in terms of the stories that you've heard about women and who's taking care of their children while they're incarcerated?
Well, oftentimes the children end up in CPS, foster care. Okay? Sometimes it's that boyfriend or husbands, depending on the culture or the background of the individual, the woman. Sometimes it's the parents, those grandparents to those children, or the siblings, the inmates' sisters or brother and their families. Sometimes they end up in foster care because the mother, the daughter, the cousin, and other folks are all in jail together.
And you know, the other thing, the first thing you said was they're in CPS. And in many cases, here's the thing with moms, it's a little bit unique to the father because, you know, one of the stats I said was most of them are with, 77% are with their children. Interestingly enough, if that mother doesn't have someone for, like the mother, the grandparents to take care of their children, they typically do, just what you said, end up behind the foster system.
Yes.
Because the difference for the man is typically the woman was taking care of the children in the first place, so it's not as great of a number of them losing their parent. So you have these cases of families where, let's say, the mom and the dad are now gone and there's no family member available. Look at what's happening. Look at the rippling impact from that woman being gone. And if on top of that, the woman was the primary caregiver of this child, what's happening to that baby? I've lost my nurturer. I've lost this person who, you know, was there for me when I stubbed my toe. And now I may have to move.
And not just because they're not available, oftentimes it's because those other family members don't qualify to be able to take that child.
That too.
Because if that child ends up in the system with CPS, then the other family members have to qualify.
That's right.
In order to be able to care for their child. And if the other family members are involved in drugs or having been in and out of the system, okay, they are not going to qualify to be able to care for that child while the mother is incarcerated, even though had that mother stayed on the outside, oftentimes she is able to care or keep that child in her home, even though she's involved in other activities too. That child has more possibility of staying with the mother than with another family member who has that history, once they've been in the system.
As I'm listening to you, I'm just thinking of the great dis-ease that has been caused around these drugs.
Yes.
You know, what you said just spoke volumes to the collateral impact, not just incarceration, but the incarceration because of these drugs. And see, we're not getting people the help that they need. We're putting them behind the walls, which is not fixing or helping to shift the problem, but just exacerbating it.
And let's go back to now the mother who is incarcerated and pregnant. And let's say she delivers that child soon after being incarcerated, and that child is born with drugs in their system.
A whole nother ball.
They are immediately removed and placed into foster care.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Until it can be worked out. Now, there's another myth.
Okay.
Okay, that if the child was a newborn and gets removed and placed into foster care, that child is not going to be impacted by that separation from their mother as much.
No.
Not true.
No.
That child still feels that connection and that disconnection that occurs when they are removed and placed elsewhere from that mother. Okay? Even though that mother may have been an addict, they may have been involved in all kinds of That's still their mother.
There's mother. You know, it's amazing that you just said that. I often think about people telling me, well, they're this or they're that. Mom, they should have gone anyway. But to that child, that's mom.
That's right.
And to the mom, that's their child. That's a connection.
Yes.
That you just can't break just because of some act that has been done. Let's shift now to looking at, it's amazing that we don't have a lot of time, but let's quickly shift to the impact. The impact that this incarceration has on a woman who didn't even commit the crime. The woman that's left outside where a crime may have happened around her household.
Oh, yeah.
You know, they run the risk of what? Losing their home.
Oh, yeah.
Being displaced.
Oh, yeah.
And they had nothing at all. So this line that the incarceration crisis runs around women and households and families and communities is major.
And if it's shown in some states, if it's shown that that crime occurred in your home.
Yes.
You said losing their home, but you weren't involved, okay?
No.
You weren't even at home.
No.
But if the crime occurred in your home, there's a law, it's called the dwelling. That crime involved within that dwelling, they will take that dwelling away from you, okay? Granted, you have to be convicted, yes, but let's say that person is not convicted, but you're talking months, sometimes years.
Before it gets cleared up.
Before it gets cleared.
So what do we do? And, you know, we just don't have enough time to talk about this. This is why we're doing this series. We're at a place now where we have to do more than talk.
Yes.
You know, we've round-tabled, summit, think tanked this thing till the cows come home, if you will.
Yes.
And so it's time for reform, but I think this has been exhilarating for me because, you know, some of the things we think about, these things that are happening to not only the women, but the men, the children, the families, we're thinking the wrong way about it. So when we get inside and looking at what's really happening, it's important for our listeners, our viewers rather, to make sure that they find a place to be a part of this. You know, whether you lobby, whether you write a policy brief, whether you go call your legislator and have them come and tell them what kinds of things are going on in your community.
And that's why we call it check the reality.
Yes.
Because you need to take the time to look at what's really happening.
What time it really is.
And then also connect yourself to someone. Reach out and help somebody that's been in this cycle.
Absolutely.
This system cycle, going inside and trying to come out and trying to get their lives in order and trying to help their children. Give back to somebody in your community. Help, help, help.
Well, viewers, you've just heard it. Help, help, help. We can be a part of the answer. You, right there, that I'm looking at right now, you can be a part of the answer to shift the paradigm on this crisis. You can be a part of checking the reality. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you'll join us on our next program. But now, go out, make this a great day. Do something good for someone else. Thank you, Ms. Sall.
Thank you.
Thank you.